Power fantasy is a very weird discussion to have. The reason is because every person's power fantasy have some degrees of dementedness. You can't discuss about power fantasy and then not feel weirded out when one person talks about the power fantasy of creating a trapped ethno-state or having cats and dogs to raid from the sky without even considering the fact that these creatures will turn into roadkills the moment they hit the ground at the top speed. But you know what? I'm not the one to judge. I have my own weird power fantasies in my head as well. So is it hypocritical for me to judge someone else's power fantasy when I myself have weird power fantasies? Perhaps, but what's particularly weird for me is when people demand more outlets that specifically cater into their own weird, demented power fantasies. It's not because their fantasies are weird or particularly disturbing, it's because their fantasies are strangely and closely tied up to the personal issues that they have in real life. Imagine if I make a video talking about how I hate cops and then I want all cops to just die in a fire. Imagine if I describe in the goriest of detail how every cop should be chased on in half, cooked by professionals, and be fed to their grieving sons and daughters. And then I talk about how GTA 5 caters into my sick and demented fantasy. You would feel a bit disturbed, right? This is the vibe that I got from this article, but it didn't start off that way. It started off by naming some of my recent Patreons. Huge thanks to Brandon Stukov for the pledges, you are fantastic. The article starts off by saying that games need more power fantasies beyond beefy dudes with big guns. My answer to the ridiculous title for this article is, well, we already have them. It's called Dark Souls, a game where you can play as a skinny lady going one-on-one with giant spiders. And it's a power fantasy for absolute masochists who love to throw their controllers out in frustration after they die for the 100th time. But no, what the article instead wants to talk about is how the power fantasies are only exclusive to white men who use guns. We need more power fantasies of non-white men who don't use guns. Again, Dark Souls is a great pick. I don't know what else to tell you, writer. And even if the world doesn't have a game like Dark Souls, I can still play GTA 5 just fine, even if the characters don't have the same skin color as me. I don't see how skin color or race should be important. The writer will elaborate why, but the justification only highlights the writer's horrendous arguments rather than proving her point. The subtitle is actually interesting. Games are many things to many people, so the easiest, broadest power fantasies don't cut it for everyone. How can you say that it's not when GTA 5 is one of the best-selling video games of all time? I think it's evident that a lot of people really enjoyed that game even to this day, and they're not even white. To put it simply, the writer's idea of a power fantasy is not the same idea that most people have about power fantasy. Most people's power fantasy will consist of things that not only they cannot achieve, but also things that they wouldn't achieve. The writer talks about the definition of power fantasy, which was horrendously broad and makes me genuinely worried about the writer's state of mind.
As a term, it is best at describing the feelings that a game can produce in a player. Epic Games' Nick Donaldson says that a power fantasy is an experience in which a person is able to do something that they wouldn't have the means or ability to do in real life.
While that is indeed true, that's not the full story. Not only is the fact that power fantasy allows us to do something that we can't do in real life, but it also allows us to do something that we wouldn't do in real life. Our curiosity and desire of power have brought us into a point where we can produce video games that let us slaughter people, and this video game is one of the best-selling video games of all time. One thing that you need to understand about power fantasy is that it can be achieved through role-playing. Role-playing is interesting and in a lot of ways fun, but a lot of journalists aren't able to dissociate the fact that the player is role-playing as a character, and that the character that they're role-playing as doesn't necessarily represent who they are or what they want to be. When you role-play as a character, it doesn't have to be a white person. Thomas Was Alone shows that we can project ourselves in freaking shapes of blocks, and most of the time, they are characters that you don't want to aspire to be in real life. Role-playing as a criminal in GTA 5 is cool, but I assure you that being a criminal is not something that most people aspire to be. Now, I agree when the writer said that there shouldn't be a discussion of whether or not power fantasies are good or bad. They exist in everyone, and as long as they can channel them in a manner that is healthy and isn't harmful to anyone, who are we to judge? But then the writer continues with this.
Power fantasies function because they give you what you don't have and what you can't access in your day-to-day life. There is something liberating about tearing around Los Santos in Grand Theft Auto 5 in a sports car, being chased by cops and then losing them in the badlands between here and the coast. It is a power fantasy precisely because I cannot do that in real life.
It is also a power fantasy precisely because you wouldn't do that in real life. This is at the point where the writer gives justification in why race matters so much in this power fantasy discussion.
But feeling powerful is not symmetrical. The same fantasies don't work for everyone. Many people in the United States are denied access to the basic power that they are supposed to enjoy in this country. Black people are broadly denied a presumption of innocence and equal access to courts. Women are denied bodily autonomy, either when walking on the streets and getting catcalled, or when it comes to their reproductive health in a doctor's office. Latinos are targeted by a specialized police force. Indigenous Americans are constantly betrayed by the United States' unwillingness to honor agreements.
I want you to read those two paragraphs just for a bit and think for a second. Assuming that what's being said is true, who in the right mind would talk about power fantasy in video games that you acquire through role-playing as characters who are not you and who you tend to not aspire to be, with the lack of power that people have in real life? Am I the only one who feels uneasy about this? The writer thinks a power fantasy is an attempt to gain power out of things that people don't have access to in real life. We don't play video games solely because reality denies us a certain amount of power. We play them because we want to roleplay as characters who have those powers. Yes, a lot of people wants to be Batman, but nobody wants to be an orphan. Nobody wants to fight Batman's constantly growing rogues gallery. Nobody wants to have their bones broken. Nobody wants to suffer from trauma. Role-playing as Batman is fun. Being Batman is not fun. I mean, just look at his face 90% of the time. I assure you, it's not fun. You are on this really strange mindset that the power fantasy that video games have should give people access to certain kinds of power that they don't have in real life. Now, if we're talking about power fantasies like being a rich billionaire who dresses up as a bat every night, I can understand. But we're talking about powers that are so weirdly grounded with reality that it's impossible to think that you don't want it. I mean, certainly we want black people to be presumed innocent and be given equal access to courts. Certainly we want women to be not denied their body autonomy. Certainly we want Latinos to be not discriminated by a specialized police force. It would be ridiculous to say that we don't. But if those problems exist in the real world and they're so concerning to the point where you have to point out that they're an issue that people have and suffer through, then what good will come from asking video games to solve the problems for you in a fictional setting? If a video game gives you the power fantasy of a black person overthrowing his oppressors, you might find your own weird personal catharsis, but that still wouldn't solve the problem in the real world. I know that people go to video games for their power fantasies, but they usually go to video games on the mindset that they don't and will never ever have these powers. To put it simply, there's a difference between powers that are mere fantasies and powers that should have been rightfully yours. You are asking for video games to give you certain powers that in your mind should be rightfully yours. That is freaking insane. Your next paragraph only illustrates my point.
This is exactly the process that Yusuf Cole dug into earlier this week in his essay on Mafia Tree's interaction with the legacy of black nationalism, and in many ways Lincoln Clay is kind of superhero figure inheriting those ideas. He's a stronger, smarter, faster, and more capable than any other real human, and he's a mythical embodiment of real political ideals. He's a power fantasy that invokes power for a group of people who have been legally and economically denied that power.
The writer then links into an article that mostly talks about the history of the Black Panthers, not the superhero, the real Black Panthers, in a manner so sympathetic and one-sided I can only express doubt. Especially when later on the writer talks about how the Black Panthers are the main targets of the FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation and how many of the members are charged with crimes and incarceration. I severely doubt that all of them are just innocent black people wanting to reclaim the power that is rightfully theirs. But I'm no expert, so take my doubt for what it's worth. The writer then criticizes the Second Amendment because, for one, it played a role in shoring up white supremacist and colonialist violence in America. I don't know, just roll with it for a moment. The writer also talked about how only 61% of gun owners are white men. How does that matter in this entire discussion? I'm very sure that you can still buy guns just fine, regardless of your skin color. And then the writer talks about how crashing clan rallies in Mafia 3 feels so liberating, but then says that it challenges the idea that the Second Amendment is only for white people. Apparently, the reason why the writer has this mindset is because the writer believed that the Black Panthers started out as a movement to give black people the right to Second Amendment? I really don't know. But then the writer calls The Division the ultimate far-right fantasy because it's a game where you murder looters and escape prisoners in a lawless New York. How is that far-right? The writer then criticized GTA for featuring a transgression willingly made in the service of the same capitalist goals that motivate the rest of society. I have no idea what that means, so please someone decipher this sentence. In summary, the writer of this article has some really odd ideas about the world, and the writer of the previous article used this as a point to highlight how Lincoln Clay from Mafia 3 is a mythical embodiment of real political ideals. So in other words, Lincoln gives you the power that the world denies you. Considering how you complain about the injustices that black people suffer from in such a disturbingly grounded manner, I want to ask, if black people are denied the power that they deserve in real life, should they have the same power as Lincoln Clay, an anti-hero whose morality is bankrupt beyond belief? Like you said, he is a power fantasy that invokes the power for a group of people who have been legally and economically denied that power. Is the power that you're referring to the power to slaughter and kill people that you perceive to be oppressing you? Is the power that you're referring to the power to rule New Bordeaux under the regime of either 3 big crime gangs or just yourself? I don't understand how Lincoln is a mythical embodiment of real political ideals when he is in a lot of ways a mass murdering criminal who works out with other gangs to take revenge on the people who killed his family. Is he the sort of person that you are striving for? Is this the figure that you truly want to be? Is this the figure that you want black people to aspire to? Yes, I know that it's ridiculous to ask someone if they want to aspire to be characters that they're aware of to be power fantasies, but I don't play Crysis 2 to become a soldier in real life and then be a dead man walking with only the nanosuit being the only reason why I'm still alive. From how you describe the situation so far, are you playing Mafia 3 because black people in real life are denied the power to kill their oppressors? I'm having tons and tons of questions here, and a lot of these are genuinely disturbing, so please for the love of God clarify.
The power fantasy, then, is a contested space, and I don't think the discussion should be centered on whether they should exist or not. Instead, the discussion should be focused on who gets to feel powerful, who gets access to digital representations of their dreams, especially in the AAA game or blockbuster space, and importantly, where are the guns in all of this?
Who gets access to digital representation of their dreams? Why should that be a discussion? Isn't the answer obvious? Everyone who has the money to buy video games? It's clear to me that your power fantasy is very bizarrely specific. You have to admit that this demand is pretty freaking selfish, especially considering that video games have given you many different types of power fantasies already. The writer then talks about the movie Death Wish in a manner that I cannot possibly believe for 1 second that an actual human being thinks this way. The writer specifically talked about the remake, but screw the remake. Charles Bronson's version kicked ass back then and still kicked ass now. You all know the story of Death Wish. A guy got his family attacked and he's out for justice. Then the writer says this.
Yet the film only works if you can manage to identify with a white man who can move through a city without being stopped for his skin color or the clothes that he is on.
Holy crap, that is one of the most idiotic points that I've ever heard in my entire life. Writer, people don't identify with Paul Kersey because his skin is white. He had his family attacked, raped, even murdered, and he wanted to take justice to those who did it. It's a very simple and basic setup. It's very much similar to the character you praised so much last time. How can you say such horrendously dumb thing? And this is if we're talking about vigilante films about white men taking justice to his own hands. Have you seen The Equalizer? I don't relate to Denzel Washington's character because he's black. Have you seen The Protector? I don't relate to Tony Jaa's character because he's Asian. The new Netflix movie Message from the King starring Chadwick Boseman is about a guy who has his sister murdered. Do I relate to him just because he's black? These people have certain issues and problems that we can relate to regardless of our skin color. Are there injustices in America where people are discriminated based on their skin color? No doubt, but your point here is essentially your family got raped and murdered by criminals? At least you're not black and being stopped by the cops because of your skin color. In other words, you are painting black people as sociopaths. The second point is even stupider. Check this out.
It only works if you can imagine yourself having access to an amount of capital that would free up your life from nighttime vigilante justice. It only works if you can see something of your life in Bruce Willis, his bald head gleaming as brightly as the submachine gun he's holding.
Writer, are you a sociopath? enough. You are struggling so much with the concept of empathy. Let me ask you this question. Can you relate to someone whose entire family is attacked, raped, and murdered? Can you relate to someone who wants to take justice to his own hands due to those circumstances? People don't relate to Paul Kersey because of what he does. They relate to him because of what happened prior that made him to do what he does. The reason why I find difficulties relating to, say, Lincoln Cliff from Mafia 3 is because in 2 of his endings, he can potentially become an even worse oppressor than the ones he wanted to take revenge on. Even in the best possible ending to him, he is still a morally bankrupt character. Paul Kersey is certainly dodgy with his morality as well, but at least his struggle requires a lot of effort on his part, when Lincoln is constantly backed up with the CIA guy and the other gangs who are just using him to acquire more and more territories. There's never a sense in which Lincoln suffers through some form of hardship, which is probably the point of a power fantasy, but it makes the character to be less relatable than Paul Kersey, which is already not so relatable to begin with. By nature's horribly bizarre law, anyone associated with Paul Kersey would suffer from horrible death. The writer then talks about how Death Wish is taking advantage of the inequalities that already exist, but Mafia 3 is about moving in spite of the inequalities. In other words, yes, I know that Paul Kersey has to get through tons and tons of hoops in order to commit his mass vigilante runs, but he's white, and therefore he still has a lot more privilege than Lincoln, who is black, and therefore a lot more oppressed. Even though he gets tons and tons of assistance from his CIA friend and his other gangs that are trying to take territories from New Bordeaux. Then we get to one very odd and hilarious part. The writer talks about how Black Panther is awesome because it isn't just that it's a fun superhero film, but it's also because Black Panther is telling us that in every scene, guns are not sufficient to solve problems. Except, in the intro where Killmonger used guns with Claw. You might notice very quick that the writer is not a big fan of guns through this paragraph. The writer then cites a couple of games that I have never heard of, and I'm very sure it's just the writer shilling. Writer, can you please point out any game in history that are more well known that support your claim? Mafia 3 isn't exactly a great one. And for that writer, I want to know what the hell is your problem with guns?
These are developers working in the independent space who avoid the easy solution of guns as magic wands, and to that end, they open up a wider space for power fantasies.
This article is a part of a big series by Waypoint discussing about guns in video games. One article in particular is about how guns don't need to be fun in order to be interesting, which is actually true in the surface. The article talks about how guns shouldn't be like in Doom, where you glorify their destructive capabilities and use it all the time, which tend to decrease their impact and make them boring. Instead, you can use guns sparingly in a way that makes the games to be more intense and dramatic, like in Silent Hill where guns are pretty freaking rare, or Stalker when guns are your last hope of survival. While it's not too bad of an article, it derails in one major point. If video games are going to treat video game guns as just mere toys, sorry to break it to you, but they are. They are toys. Stop comparing video game guns with real life guns. Guns in real life may have a significant impact towards people's lives, but guns in video games are just going to make people on the other side rage quit as you kill them for the 100th time. Just because video game guns remind you of the guns in real life doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same impact, nor should they have the same impact. The entire problem of these Waypoint articles is how the writers have a severe bias towards guns, and they would extend these problems even towards fictional depictions of them, just like how Waypoint did with LGBT characters.
Violence in games exists as a kind of amorphous concept that we, creators and critics alike, too often fail to inspect as closely as it warrants. The gun, sitting at the center of all of this as a blood-soaked reminder of the stakes at hand, is just the most visible symbol of a medium's increasingly deadened understanding of life and death.
The medium's increasingly deadened understanding of life and death. So you're not suggesting that gamers are insecure of the masses not accepting video games as art. You are insecure of the masses not accepting video games as art. Let's get back to that title. You know what, writer? I think being fun is just enough.